All right. In the previous video, I finished off season 1 of The Next Generation. In an episode that spent a lot of time pondering the things that were the road not taken in Star Trek The Next Generation. And with that, I felt like it would be a good idea to take a detour because, TTRPGs, when you're making your own modules for them, you don't need to stick to just the stuff that's actually seen on screen. You can add in other things as well. So let's take a look. I'm probably going to have to do several episodes of this, but take a look at Star Trek The Next Generation's unused story ideas and see what aspects of them were actually cool ideas. Like one, this is actually something that kind of sort of did get used in the show, actually. Okay. That episode where Worf briefly visits multiple alternate realities. In one of those alternate realities, he's married to Deanna Troi. Well, one of the cut story ideas was actually for Worf to marry Deanna Troi in the main timeline and not just that weird alternate timeline. Because, see, that's the thing with it, is that they had originally established that Troi was emotionally attached to Riker in the first episode of The Next Generation. So having Troi marry Riker would mean rethinking the relationship of the characters and would potentially create a personality conflict. But, hey, you're writing your own story. Now, that said, I wouldn't necessarily write that kind of story if it's going to be irrelevant. An alternate universe where Worf is married to Troi and doing something with that as a key element of the story, could be fun. But I do kind of have to treat it with a gentle touch. Don't want to just make that the entire story and forget to put in something for the players to do. Other fun things. Guinan having children. See, that's another thing that got mentioned in the show, is that Guinan did actually have children at one point in her life. Where those children are, who those children are, isn't actually something that gets well established. However, Martis Mazur was at one point in the process meant to be one of Guinan's children. Because, as we found out, the Elarians were mostly assimilated or killed. So there's actually very few of them left. So the idea that Guinan's children would be accompanying her on the same refugee ship that ended up on Earth, it's a possibility. Of course, Guinan's character in general has multiple very strange plot developments that they did with her that make using the character hard because of just how many inconsistencies in story are there. Like, how did she end up on Earth in the 1800s? Because that actually was Guinan. That wasn't a woman who looks like Guinan. That was actually Guinan. And her homeworld was far enough away from Earth that when her homeworld was assimilated by the Borg wouldn't reach the Federation for another 100 years. What? I don't get that. I really, really don't get that. But whatever. Moving on. Yeah, playing with abortion. This is something that science fiction has done on several things. It's like weird alien monster babies and stuff like that. And now that's an interesting aspect with it, though, is that the whole like alien monster baby thing, sometimes that actually ends up killing the mother if it's not taken care of because of the fact that the monster baby is not a human and also not necessarily a sentient life form. That can be a thing. Uh, it's just a vague idea, though. Now, while all good things, what did actually end up being the season finale of season 7, they had originally done a completely different version of it that was meant to be the season 6 season finale. Um, but it got in some ways certain aspects of it got used for Star Trek Generations. But hey, you writing a TTRPG, that particular story concept. Um, well, we don't actually know a whole lot about this, other than the having the Enterprise D get partially destroyed and having the saucer section crash. That's literally the only thing we know about it. Oh, also, according to Ron D. Moore, that the vague concept of the story was all they got to, so hadn't actually fleshed it out either. Um. Okay. Now, see, the whole Amish people thing. There are actually episodes of TNG that deal with pre-warp civilizations, and some of those are actually uh, civilizations that are rural and agrarian. The Mintakans, for example. In many ways, this reminds me of the Mintakans because of the fact that their civilization is so primitive that the concept of electricity is alien to them. They do like the stereotypical um, farmers who don't know how to read and write thing because, their civilization is just that primitive, supposedly. The exact specifics of why the Mintakans are like this was never actually explored. It was basically just left up to the viewer to assume that their civilization was just technologically undeveloped. Which makes sense for this here. Okay, so this one here. Arthur Sellers came up with something that was so techno jargon specific that they decided that it was too convoluted in terms of techno jargon. Well, that is actually something that you need to kind of sort of keep in mind is that techno jargon, if it's just random words, eventually becomes alphabet soup and loses all meaning. This here though doesn't give us any ideas on what his pitch actually was. But Arthur Sellers allegedly was using technical jargon that was real and not Star Trek technical jargon, which is an interesting distinction because of the fact that in the Star Trek universe, they use certain words and phrases to refer to things, which, from a real world perspective, are in fact not real. Um, but from an in-universe perspective, they are because in-universe logic, in-universe uh, phrases to describe the in-universe logic, and the in-universe logic often invokes the idea of physical laws that haven't been discovered by science yet in the real world. So they use those phrases and terms instead of the real world equivalents, although they do sometimes use real world terms. This one, we don't even know which specific words and concepts were being used here, so not a whole lot else to say about it. Armus! You know, I did a thing about the Armus episode, and one of the things that I mentioned is that they did actually, in Lower Decks, eventually have a brief use of the Armus character. However, this brief use of the Armus character was little more than a gag and not a story featuring the character. Now, what Sagan wanted to do, interesting question, but we don't know. Because the whole logic of Armus being on a planet that the Federation has declared off limits, and thus, everyone stay away from this planet, or the dangerous thing that's imprisoned here will escape and eat you. Well, there are people in the universe stupid enough to see that and go, oh, wait, the Federation declared the planet off limits. That must mean there's something valuable there that we can steal. Yeah, you should figure out why it's off limits before going there. Anyways. Oh, yeah, they wanted to do even more Barclay episodes. Now, one of the things that's interesting is having Barclay write holographic characters that would go on to be real characters later. And that's what this was apparently working on, but they didn't actually go with it, so we're never going to find out exactly what they would have done with it if they had. And a lot of these are things where the writers decided they didn't actually have a good idea as to how to develop it into something that would actually be usable for a filmed episode. Thus, they scrapped it because they felt the idea was incomplete and thus unusable due to being incomplete. Now, this is an interesting take on the super alien concept because of the fact that we do, in fact, see multiple alien entities in Star Trek that are functionally immobile. Like in Star Trek Voyager with the telepathic pitcher plant, which is basically a carnivorous nebula. It somehow pulls people into it and then does something to eat them or whatever. That entity, while malicious and malevolent, does seem to have some level of intelligence, and it is incredibly old. Now, this is an interesting concept, though, with this particular one, because this is a sentient entity that is literally as old as the universe itself, but because of the fact that it's embedded in the fabric of space, it is functionally immobile because of the fact that it's literally a chunk of space. Very strange concept. Also, it does kind of sort of go with the whole thing with Nagelum's deal, because the fact that Nagelum, we don't really know what Nagelum was. The Enterprise entered a region of space that seemed to come to life and have space itself acting to imprison the ship and taunting the crew by telling them that they've been imprisoned and so on and so forth. This, however, seems to be a largely benign entity that's just bored and wants people to talk to it. Alrighty then. Blood and Fire. this is a kind of a strange concept because, like, you know, um, they do actually have things involving blood donor stuff in Star Trek on a few episodes. It's just not a huge, commonly used thing. And this trying to make it as the um core aspect of the episode is a strange idea. And I think that the problem they had here is that they just couldn't come up with a way to make it actually good. And, all of the stuff that they have here talking about it, they don't really say what exactly the idea that they had to make this episode, workable actually was, which kind of makes me um, wondering about it. It's like, why did David Gerrold feel so strongly about this being worth telling that he chose to leave TNG because they didn't do it? Huh? Like, yes, blood donation in real life is kind of important, but why? Why is that the big aspect of this? It doesn't feel like something that would actually work in a Star Trek setting very well because the fact that in Star Trek setting they do cloned blood because they figured out how to do that. And which is, one of those things where in real life that doesn't work, but in Star Trek they can actually do that. Although, it's not something that they can do as a emergency procedure. It's something that they need prep time for. So, you would have some sort of blood substitute as a readily available thing, and then put that into someone, and then might prepare cloned blood for a more long-term solution. Anyway, though, I think that's a good place to take a break on this because, as you can see from the scroll bar, this is a rather long wiki page, and I'm not going to read the whole thing in one episode. Skipping over these ideas is going to take several episodes. And this is going to end up being, like one of those things is like looking at which of the scrapped ideas is actually useful, because there's reasons these things got scrapped. Are they reasons that would be a problem for you when you're writing a TTRPG? That's the real question here. And sometimes it's something that's, well, like for this one, how to make the episode exciting. That seems to be the real issue with the Big Bang alien one, is that, oh, you found a random alien. That's nice. Fine. Enjoy talking to it. Next. I mean, if all you do is encounter this alien entity and talk to it, that's not much of an episode. And I suspect that that's actually probably the reason why that they scrapped this, is that they just couldn't come up with a good way to make the episode interesting. Because all of the episodes of Star Trek as aired had some kind of narrative conflict. Usually not between members of the crew, although there are exceptions. More often, the conflict comes from the alien of the week or something like that. But the conflict isn't necessarily the core of the episode, and that's where the formula gets bent and twisted. It's because in the neutral zone, the core of the episode was investigating something that's actually only relegated to the opening of the scene of the episode and the closing scene. They don't actually spend the majority of the episode dealing with what is ostensibly the main focus of the episode. Instead, they get sidetracked with a plot involving people that had been cryogenically frozen for several hundred years, because they just randomly happened to find frozen people. Because that was something they needed to tack onto the episode in order to make the plot long enough to fill an entire episode. And also it gave them a source of conflict outside of just talking to a Romulan for a few minutes. Because as we find out in the episode, the Romulans, Tebok and Thay, that the crew of the Enterprise encounter in the episode are actually quite happy to talk. It's just that Picard didn't know what the right questions were. And that is where the episode uh, ran ran off the rails in terms of actually having the Romulans being the core of the episode. They just needed something to pad it. Otherwise, they'd have had like a 20-minute episode. And that wouldn't have been something that they can fill an hour-long time slot with. But in a TTRPG, you don't have that same limitation. Obviously, you're going to want to have an episode take a certain amount of time, but not as linearly and uh, confined in a way that the TV show was. And with that, I will leave off for now. See you guys next time.